Hello everyone, here is my Schubert's Unfinished Symphony research project. I did briefly go over this piece in my Schmurf project, but if you did not see that, then that's awesome because then this is brand new information and you won't be bored. So let's begin. Requiems and symphonies that are composed towards the end of a composer's lives tend to be left unfinished. For a composer like Mozart, who died before he was able to finish his Requiem, his student Süssmayr was able to complete it. As for a composer like Schubert, who had written a symphony with only 2 movements, it seemed unfinished without any concrete indication that it was completed. In addition, because Schubert did not mention this piece to his friends, because Schubert did not mention this piece to his friends, there was not a complete way to find out if it was complete or not, and it wasn't found until 40 years after Schubert's death. This video and research will explore several conspiracies on Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, also known as Symphony No. 8, and have a detailed analysis of the piece. In addition to what Schubert's life was like at the time of writing the symphony and his death. It is possible Schubert intended his symphony to only have 2 movements, or could have been left unfinished. So, brief background. It's called his Unfinished Symphony. That's what it commonly is called by, but it's also called Symphony No. 8. It was written in late 1822 or early 1823 and only has 2 movements. Conspiracy theories. So the big question to this big piece, this famous piece, is, was his symphony finished? Why or why not? And they're conspiracies for a reason, because there were so many different sources and perspectives that people have that give good reason and evidence to the question of if we think, yes, his symphony was finished, and also, no, it was not finished. It only has 2 movements, and it should have had 4. So I really like how Solomon discusses his symphony by saying, once again proven as a vortex for the latest upheaval in Schubert interpretation. In other words, once you dive into this subject, you're going to find so many different ideas and perspectives, like mentioned before, that you're almost pulled into a vortex of whether or not it's true, whether or not you believe it's finished or believe it's not. So, first thing is, who had this score and how did that person get it? So, the person who ended up having it for 40 years was the brother of Joseph Hüttenbrenner. I don't know if it's Hüttenbrenner or Hüttenbrenner, but I'm going to go with Hüttenbrenner just because that sounds more German. So yes, it was in the hands of Anselm Hüttenbrenner. Schubert had told his older brother Joseph that Schubert wanted Joseph to have it, and he wanted Joseph to bring it to this elite music society. I don't have it written in my presentation, but the society called Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, maybe that's how you pronounce it, basically an elite music society. He wanted his older brother Joseph to bring it to them, because he was already a member. So instead, after Schubert gave it to Joseph, for some reason, gave it to his younger brother, Anselm. So Anselm was the one who kept it for 40 years. Solomon also states later on that Anselm had it for 40 years, and it wasn't until 1865 that he gave it away finally to a music society and they were able to finally bring it up to the light and, revel in Schubert's amazing work. I call this conspiracy number 1, which is Anselm having this piece in his desk for 40 years, because it's kind of like a debate. So even though Schubert did intend to give it to Joseph, but Joseph gave it to his brother, Anselm, it still doesn't add up, because after Schubert gave it away, he never mentioned of that piece again. And it was kind of like, oh, here, take this from me, bring it to them. That was it. And instead, when he did have a chance to show off a piece to that music society, once he was, later on, he was invited to that music society, he didn't think to mention it. He didn't, he was like, oh, I'm going to get you guys a really great composition. I'm going to make you a grand symphony. And instead of bringing this unfinished symphony to them, the Symphony Number 8, instead, I believe he was thinking of the Great Symphony in C major. So then it's just kind of, it doesn't add up why he just forgot about his own piece, which is, we go into the next conspiracy. And before I go into that, I'm gonna share a quote from Barry. This is the source. This might just be possible for a short song and his most prolific leader output, but inconceivable for a major symphonic work which marks a striking departure from his earlier symphonies in command of compositional technique and depth of emotional range. So this is going into the idea mentioned in the previous slide. How do you just forget about a huge symphonic work? It's one thing to kind of forget about, a lead that you wrote that's like 2 or 3 minutes, and it's, a piano and someone singing, like a soprano or whatever, but it's kind of unrealistic to think that he forgot about this symphony. Conspiracy number 3. It was possible that Hüttenbrenner, and I'm going to refer to Hüttenbrenner as with the idea that we're talking about Anselm, not Joseph, not anyone else, just Anselm, because he is the guy that we will only be talking about from now on, and he's the one that had it for 40 years. So they thought maybe he didn't want to give up Schubert's score because maybe he needed the money later. And what I mean by he needed the money as in when he was going to hand over that score, he was going to be given money or some kind of thank you in some way. He would have benefited from it. So it's kind of unclear why he would hold on to the score for so long. That's another part that doesn't make sense. Number 4, why did Hüttenbrenner burn Schubert's diary? That was very unlikely and very confusing at the time, because usually for composers, when they have a diary, it's similar to like a score. You will again benefit if you hand it in. You probably will get some kind of reward in money, or your name will be put in somewhere. But the reason behind this idea of the fact that he burned his diary, it seemed to happen at the same time that the symphony was written, so 1822, 1823, and it seems one of them, either Anselm or Schubert, or I guess even Joseph, could have been involved with incriminating information or sensitive information that they didn't want anyone else to know about. And this, because of that, could have been a reason to why Hüttenbrenner remained silent for those 40 years. Another one, number 5, when Hüttenbrenner, as Hüttenbrenner was the only one who held on to the score, and handed it in finally in 1865. He saw no reason to hand over Schubert's piano sketches as well, because they didn't seem to resemble any additional movements to his symphony. He didn't think it didn't go along with the already written movement 1 and 2. Number 6. Also, these two also by Ginger Rich, which is my source listed down here. Oh, no, go back. So Ginger Rich is a part of the believers that they believe that Schubert's symphony was indeed finished. He believed this, so that would be these two right here. He believed this because he saw, sorry, that's the wrong, because of the fact that Schubert did not return to his symphony and left it untouched for several months, because he was Hüttenbrenner was a close friend, he didn't think that if Schubert really cared about this piece and wanted to come back to it, he wouldn't have left it untouched for several months. That's just unlike him, and unlike how he treated his previous compositions. Instead, he kept talking about bringing a grand new symphony to that elite music society, and he, again, previously, as mentioned, he wasn't going to bring up this Symphony Number 8. Conspiracy number 7. So, wait. I just mentioned that one. Ha ha ha. So number 8, I guess. No, stop it. Number 8, Barry kind of brings this point up, how she is for the idea that it was not finished and that he would have written 4 movements, and she comes up with this idea, I guess you could say, that at the time of his death, when he contracted syphilis in late 1822 or 1823, that there are possible connections of his disease and the composition of his unfinished symphony. She kind of mentions that at the time he was composing his symphony, that in some way his ideas had been associated with his upcoming death. This possibility could have been very true, as Schubert became restricted with his activities, and he didn't have that same energy as before. And I don't have this quote, I believe. No, I don't, but I'm going to quote it for you right now, to just help with the fact that Schubert was so ill. Schubert quotes, "The circumstances of my health still do not permit me to go outside the house." So, for a common disease that Schubert had, which was syphilis, it was a common disease carried throughout composers at the time, and definitely affected their daily life and work. So, affected their ability to compose. The idea that Schubert knew his work would not be finished and completed only 2 movements could help prove the possibility that his work was left unfinished and was intended to have 4 movements. So moving on to mainly just talking about confirming why Schubert's symphony was not finished. We're going to just talk about that based on Schubert's personalities, his diagnosis of syphilis, and his close attention to what he did with tempo and dynamics. So Barry previously mentioned his symphony should have been more than 2 movements, and she thinks that because of his disease, he didn't want to continue. I don't know if I mentioned this before. I guess, okay. So Drawing attention to Schubert's personality, also supported through information by his friends, Schubert had one side that was very friendly and dedicated to his work. His other side was very uncontrolled and was a harm to himself, really, by drinking heavily and having several sexual encounters with different people. And it's said that his personalities showed up in his music, and it is quoted by having sudden flare-ups, which add shocking disruptions in the slow movements. Disruptions. So I'll show you in a couple of examples, and of course in his Unfinished Symphony, that, you know, maybe you're in a very lyrical section of his piece, it's all calm, it all makes sense, and then out of nowhere you hear like a huge drastic change in dynamics and instruments going crazy, and it's like, where did this come from? It kind of comes out of nowhere. So that's kind of the idea, that there are two sides to Schubert's personality, and that some believe that his personality was his music. Sometimes be very calm and relaxed, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you'd hear a giant shift in music, or a giant shift in emotion. So we're going to talk about then how he buries the idea of his composition, the Symphony Number 8, Unfinished Symphony, B minor symphony, and the disease together. So Barry mentions his syphilis, and to further support the idea that his symphony was truly unfinished is because of the fact it was at the same time he could have been diagnosed with his disease. So as mentioned before, he seemed to have completely forgotten about his symphony, even when it could have been a great time to present it to the music society he was recently invited to. As Barry states, the idea that Schubert buried this piece because of wanting to bury his diagnosis with syphilis seems relevant, seems believable. By burying his composition, and by burying that idea that he had syphilis and he had this awful diagnosis, that this would give him the ability to freely compose without having this disease affect his composition and creative ideas. If Schubert did not want this piece to be discovered or performed, it was because of second thoughts, and he did not want to admit his diagnosis of syphilis. So that's Barry's another one of her ideas, another one of her beliefs, that no, this piece was not finished. It should have had more movements, but there were a lot of components to why people might believe that. So example 1, you'll hear this later on in his piece, but by looking at it, you can see this all makes sense. It kind of all goes together. It all makes sense. And you go along, and then all of a sudden you have this, like, you have some rests here, and then loud, loud, loud. So I like to think of it as, okay, these are his thoughts. Like, oh, I'm just thinking. Everything's normal. Everything's adding up. Like, everything completely makes sense. And then it's kind of like you're thinking about something, and you're just kind of like, wait, I'm not that sure. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, like, I don't like this. I'm acting out. I'm going to make bad decisions. That's how I look at this, using Barry's idea of having his two personalities come shine through his music. So we go into another article by Brown, which is Performance Tradition, Study in Proportional Tempos and the First Movements of Schubert's Symphonies. So, as Brown looks at some of the first people that found his Schubert's symphony and performed it, he notices some errors written by Schubert, and they were only corrected later on in later recordings of his piece. Paying attention specifically to his rhythm and dynamics, they were supposed to be very consistent and instead have dotted rhythms switch to eighth notes or quarter notes. I use the example from Schubert's great C major symphony, because it has really good, it shows clearly Schubert's fluid movement of his themes and the slow progression of heavier orchestration. There's also an example of Schubert creating a retard using his rhythm, and I will show that example. So as you can see, we have 3 quarter notes in triplets. And then all of a sudden, they are switched to just quarter notes, 4 quarter notes. And if there is some information that you can read from that, but it's basically kind of the same thing that I'm saying over here, that Schubert plans this out. He's doing this, he's making these quarter notes triplets, he's doing this on purpose so that as he slows down later in his music, it's a smoother transition than just immediately like changing the tempo and changing how the rhythm is marked. So let's move on to the analysis. So I like to think of movement 1 as the beginning is very unsettled, and then you hear the oboe and clarinet in unison, and it has a very romantic feel to it. It sounds like it's from the Romantic period. And, the unsettlement kind of goes on a little bit, and then all of a sudden you hear this complete idea. You hear, oh, like, I understand what's going on now. Everything's okay. This is the only part, really, that is very light, and the overall rest of the piece is very dark. This is the form of the piece. This is the analysis part. I also will show you my other analysis in another tab, and I will link it in the discussion box. But let's just go through some of the times, just a couple seconds, just to orally hear what's going on, and especially hear this complete clarity that, kind of sounds like everything's all right. And as you're listening to these specific sections, I think using Barry's idea, her opinion, her perspective of Schubert's 2 personalities, I definitely think this is this can easily be shown in his symphony. Nope. I'm just going to use this little box so I can keep track of the times. Oh, exposition. This is the unsettlement that we hear. And that repeats. So we're going to go to theme 2. And see how different, how very different it's gonna sound. That's good enough. let's listen to the development and recap, just so we can have a full understanding of the movement, of movement 1. Perfect. No, let's. And now let's go to the recapitulation so that we can just fully come to terms. Nope, that's not what I wanted. So now we're gonna come back to the beginning. And then you kind of hear the theme creep back in. So I just want to go back to the beginning. And like I said, I really want to focus to that complete clarity and the unsettlement, because like I said before, I think you can see Schubert's 2 personalities that Barry talks about. So the beginning. And now let's go where we have complete clarity. It's kind of like, oh, okay, everything's okay now. There's also a shift in the key that we're in. So that's also another thing to note. So now let's go to movement 2. So it's completely different than movement 1. First off, we're in a major key, E major. So we're gonna go through the same process. I definitely think I don't think it's as, with the first movement, you can definitely see, you can use the idea of Schubert's 2 personalities. I think they definitely shine through, but for this one, we're just gonna focus on the form. And now let's put it in, which I'm sure we're very close. Now let's skip to the development here. We're going to skip through all these because it really just repeats this pattern. So we're going to go to the end of the development. Oh no, what did I do? So you can definitely hear the difference in the development. It's completely different than what we've heard. It gets more intense as well. Oh my goodness, stop doing that. And then we have the end again. So just some final facts that I thought I would add at the end of this presentation. So, as discussed before, either when Schubert wrote a new piece or he performed it, it was written down usually on that specific composition. So in this case, we believe that this symphony, this unfinished symphony, Symphony Number 8, was written in late 1822 or early 1823. But because of the marked date that he has on other works besides this one, it definitely shows that he was writing symphonies soon after he just finished Symphony Number 8, like about a week or 10 days after he finished it, and just immediately moved on. I just thought that was a fun fact. And something that just is not mentioned because it's kind of a fun fact. Schubert's unfinished symphony was not discovered and wasn't performed until April 6, 1867, at the Crystal Palace in Vienna. And both of these, all this information comes from this right here. So, the conclusion of Schubert's wonderful piece. It's easy to notice Schubert's symphony does not follow the pre-1824 style of works, but he did want his piece sent to the Graz, which is a place in Vienna, showing that it's possible that he knew his form of the symphony was different. It was special, but he did eventually want it showcased. He did want other people to know about this. He wanted to be known for this piece because it was different, and he wanted to be a part of that. In the book we read in class, The Life of Schubert by Gibbs, it is very unfortunate that Schubert was never able to hear his symphony as a whole. And he was never able to know how famous it would become. And overall, because of all of these perspectives and the evidence that everyone shows, there is no concrete answer to if this symphony was supposed to be written as is, or if Schubert did plan on writing it having 4 movements. this is my works cited, and this is a picture of my dog. Thank you.